The journey back to Earth took on a completely different character than Sarah's original kidnapping. Instead of traveling as a prisoner aboard a Vorthak vessel, she found herself as an honored guest aboard a Pyrethan ship that defied every human understanding of physics and engineering. The ship itself was grown rather than built, its crystalline hull shaped by the collective will of its crew. Unlike the mechanical corridors of the Vorthak vessel, this ship felt alive, responding to the needs and emotions of its occupants. Sarah's quarters were a marvel of organic architecture that adapted to her presence, providing perfect temperature, lighting, and even gravitational orientation. But the most remarkable aspect of the return journey was her traveling companions. The Ancient One had insisted on personally escorting Sarah home, bringing with it a delegation of Pyrethans who were eager to establish formal contact with humanity. For the first time in their species' history, the Pyrethans were approaching another civilization not as judges or conquerors, but as equals seeking mutual understanding. Chrystalis had appointed herself as Sarah's permanent liaison, a role that seemed to delight the young Pyrethan despite its vast age by human standards. Through their conversations during the journey, Sarah learned that the consciousness network discovery had created a revolution in Pyrethan society. Ancient certainties were being questioned, and for the first time in eons, they were actively seeking to learn from other species. "Your people have accomplished something we thought impossible," Chrystalis explained as they watched Earth grow larger through the ship's organic viewports. "You have shown us that power and wisdom are not the same thing." Sarah nodded, understanding the significance of that realization. The Pyrethans had spent millions of years accumulating power and knowledge, but they had lost touch with the curiosity and wonder that drove true discovery. Humanity's fresh perspective had reminded them of what they had sacrificed in their pursuit of dominance. As Earth came into view, Sarah felt a complex mix of emotions. She was home, but she was also returning as something more than the girl who had been kidnapped weeks ago. She carried with her knowledge that would fundamentally change humanity's understanding of its place in the universe. The Pyrethan ship's arrival did not go unnoticed. Earth's early warning systems detected the massive vessel long before it reached the inner solar system, triggering alerts that sent every space agency and military organization into emergency protocols. Sarah found herself in the surreal position of having to negotiate first contact procedures between her own species and beings who could casually destroy solar systems. The Ancient One proved surprisingly patient with human caution. Instead of demanding immediate audience with Earth's leaders, it agreed to remain in orbit while Sarah served as an intermediary. The irony wasn't lost on her. The girl who had been kidnapped as a primitive specimen was now Earth's primary diplomatic contact with the most powerful beings in the galaxy. The initial communications were chaotic. Earth's government struggled to comprehend the scale of what they were dealing with, while human scientists found themselves faced with evidence that their understanding of physics was fundamentally incomplete. But gradually, through Sarah's mediation, meaningful dialogue began to emerge. The revelation of the consciousness network created the greatest disruption. Earth's philosophers, scientists, and spiritual leaders found themselves grappling with proof that consciousness was indeed a fundamental force of the universe. The implications for human understanding of mind, soul, and existence itself would take generations to fully explore. But it was the practical applications that captured humanity's immediate attention. The network offered access to knowledge and perspectives accumulated over millions of years by thousands of species. Medical advances, technological innovations, and scientific discoveries beyond human imagination were available to any species that joined the collective. The offer wasn't without its challenges. Consciousness networking required mental disciplines that humanity had barely begun to explore. The process would take decades of development, and not all humans would be capable of making the transition. But for those who could, it represented an evolutionary leap that would make them literally superhuman in their capabilities. Sarah found herself at the center of these discussions, serving as Earth's first consciousness network contact and humanity's primary source of information about galactic civilization. The girl who had dreamed of seeing the stars had become the bridge between humanity and the greater cosmos. Months passed as Earth struggled to adapt to its new reality. The Pyrethans established a permanent embassy in orbit, while human scientists worked frantically to understand technologies that operated on principles they were only beginning to grasp. The consciousness network remained patient, occasionally sending messages of encouragement and offering guidance to human researchers attempting to develop networking capabilities. But perhaps the most significant change was in humanity's perspective on itself. The discovery that they were part of a vast galactic community, and that their unique approach to consciousness made them valuable to ancient civilizations, gave humans a new sense of purpose and confidence. Sarah watched these changes from her position as Earth's first interstellar diplomat, a role she had never asked for, but found herself uniquely qualified to fill. She had grown from a kidnapped teenager into someone who could speak as an equal with beings that had existed since the dawn of galactic civilization. The Vorthak, incidentally, had received quite a shock when they learned what their simple kidnapping mission had actually accomplished. The species that had seen humans as primitive specimens found themselves facing diplomatic sanctions from civilizations they had never known existed. The consciousness network had little patience for species that treated sentient beings as commodities. As Sarah stood in the observation deck of Earth's first interstellar embassy, watching the blue-green world that had given birth to humanity, she reflected on how much had changed. The scared girl who had been dragged into space against her will had discovered that humans were capable of surprising even the most ancient and powerful beings in the galaxy. Her father's stories about human persistence had proven prophetic in ways she never could have imagined. Humanity's refusal to give up their insatiable curiosity and their ability to find new perspectives on old problems had opened doors that had been closed for millions of years. The future stretched before humanity like an infinite frontier. The consciousness network offered paths to mental evolution that could make humans into beings of pure thought, while the physical galaxy remained full of worlds to explore and civilizations to meet. For the first time in galactic history, a species was positioned to pursue both paths simultaneously. Sarah smiled as she received another message through the quantum consciousness link she had learned to maintain. The network was sharing discoveries made by human researchers who had successfully achieved preliminary networking capabilities. Their unique perspective was already generating insights that surprised beings with millions of years of experience. The ancient Pyrothons had been right. About one thing, humanity was indeed a remarkable species. They just hadn't understood why until a kidnapped girl had shown them that sometimes the most important discoveries came from the most unexpected sources. Earth spun slowly below her, a small blue world that had just announced its presence to the greatest civilization the galaxy had ever known, and that civilization had responded with wonder, welcome, and an invitation to help reshape the future of consciousness itself. The stars that had once seemed impossibly distant now felt like neighbors. And somewhere among them, other young species were probably taking their first tentative steps toward the greater community that awaited them. Sarah Martinez, former kidnapping victim and current interstellar diplomat, looked out at the infinite cosmos and knew that humanity's greatest adventures were just beginning. The response from the consciousness network came faster than anyone had anticipated. Within hours of detecting Earth's signature, the quantum consciousness detector began registering focused attention from dozens of sources across the galaxy. It was as if Sarah's homeworld had suddenly lit up like a beacon, drawing the interest of beings that had remained hidden for eons. Sarah watched the displays with growing excitement and concern. The attention wasn't threatening. The signatures suggested curiosity rather than hostility, but the sheer number of responses was overwhelming. Earth had gone from invisible to the center of galactic interest in a matter of hours. "They are attempting to establish communication," Chrysalis observed, her massive form bent over the detection equipment. The quantum entanglement patterns suggest a form of consciousness-to-consciousness contact that bypasses traditional communication methods. The Ancient One moved closer to the displays, its presence making the crystalline chamber ring with harmonic resonances. "This network has been operating beneath our awareness for unknown periods. They have developed communication methods that exist entirely outside the electromagnetic spectrum." Sarah felt a chill of realization. While species like the Pyrothans had been using their advanced abilities to communicate across space through psychic means, an entirely different type of civilization had evolved quantum consciousness networking. These beings had found ways to link their minds directly through the fundamental structure of reality itself. The implications were staggering. Traditional spacefaring civilizations like the Pyrothans, Vorthak, and others represented only one branch of galactic development. The consciousness network represented another path entirely, one that prioritized mental evolution over physical expansion. "Can we understand what they're trying to communicate?" Sarah asked, studying the complex patterns flowing across the displays. Crystallis began running analysis protocols through her vast intellect. "The mathematical structures are unlike anything in our databases. They appear to be using consciousness itself as a language, transmitting concepts directly, rather than symbols or words." Sarah had an idea. "What if we try to respond using the same method? If consciousness is a fundamental force, then maybe we can learn to manipulate it the same way they do." The suggestion sent ripples of uncertainty through the assembled Pyrothans. They were creatures of immense psychic power, but their abilities operated on different principles than what they were observing in the network. "The risk is considerable," the Ancient One warned. "Attempting to interface with unknown consciousness networks could damage or destroy your mind." Sarah looked up at the massive creature that had once planned to keep her as a pet. Everything humans have ever accomplished involved taking risks that seemed impossible. Besides, if these beings wanted to hurt us, they probably would have done it already. She turned back to the detector controls, her mind racing with possibilities. The quantum consciousness field operated at the intersection of thought and physics. If she could find a way to modulate her own consciousness to match the network's frequencies, she might be able to establish direct contact. "I need to modify the detector to work in reverse," she said. "Instead of just receiving consciousness signatures, I need to be able to transmit them." The Pyrothans worked with unprecedented speed to reconfigure their equipment. The chamber filled with activity as crystalline matrices were rewoven and energy fields redirected. Sarah found herself at the center of an alien technology that was being rebuilt around her specific needs. As the modifications neared completion, Sarah felt a growing sense of anticipation. She was about to attempt something that no member of her species had ever tried: direct, consciousness-to-consciousness communication with alien beings across interstellar distances. Crystallis approached her with something that might have been concern. "The interface is complete, but we cannot predict what will happen when you attempt to connect. Human consciousness operates on different principles than Pyrothan awareness." Sarah nodded, understanding the risk. But the opportunity was too important to ignore. If humanity was going to take its place in the galactic community, they needed to understand all aspects of that community, including the hidden consciousness network that apparently connected vast numbers of species. She placed her hands on the modified control interface and felt the system come alive around her. The sensation was unlike anything she had ever experienced. Through the quantum connection, she could sense the vast web of consciousness that spanned the galaxy, like an invisible nervous system. The network was ancient beyond imagination, but also constantly evolving. New nodes appeared as species achieved consciousness networking capabilities, while others faded as civilizations transcended the need for physical existence. Sarah realized she was glimpsing the true backbone of galactic civilization, not the spacefaring empires that the Pyrothans knew about, but the consciousness collective that had been growing and adapting for millions of years. Tentatively, she reached out with her own consciousness, trying to establish contact with the nearest node. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Alien thoughts flooded her mind, carrying concepts and emotions that had no equivalent in human experience. But beneath the alienness, Sarah detected something familiar: curiosity. These beings were as interested in her as she was in them. The human consciousness was unique to them, operating on principles they had never encountered before. Through the connection, Sarah began to understand the true scope of the network. It included species that had evolved past the need for physical bodies, artificial intelligences that had achieved consciousness through quantum computing, and collective minds that spanned entire star systems. Some nodes represented individual beings, while others were vast group consciousnesses containing billions of linked minds. The communication method was indeed direct concept transfer. Instead of translating thoughts into words or symbols, the network transmitted pure meaning from one consciousness to another. Sarah found herself understanding alien concepts that had no human equivalent. while simultaneously sharing human ideas that fascinated her contacts. Through the exchange, she learned that the consciousness network had been aware of physical spacefaring civilizations like the Pyrothans for eons. They observed but rarely interfered, seeing these species as following a different evolutionary path. The network focused on mental and spiritual development rather than physical expansion and conquest. But humanity represented something new, a species that was simultaneously pursuing both paths. Humans were developing advanced technology and expanding into space, while also showing the mental flexibility and curiosity that made consciousness networking possible. The network beings were excited by this combination. Most species eventually chose one path or the other, either becoming physical powerhouses like the Pyrothans or transcending into pure consciousness. Humanity appeared to be attempting both simultaneously, which opened up possibilities that the network had never considered. Sarah felt the weight of representing her entire species in this first contact. Through her connection, billions of alien consciousnesses were forming their first impressions of human thought and culture. She tried to project the best of humanity, their curiosity, determination, creativity, and capacity for growth. The response was overwhelmingly positive. The network found human consciousness refreshing in its chaos and unpredictability. Where most advanced species had developed rigid mental structures, humans retained the flexibility to constantly reinvent themselves and their understanding of reality. As the connection stabilized, Sarah began receiving what could only be described as an invitation. The network was offering humanity a place in their collective, a chance to join the hidden civilization that operated beneath the galaxy's surface. But they wanted more than just membership. They wanted partnership. Humanity's unique perspective could help the network understand the physical universe in new ways. While the network could accelerate human mental evolution by millions of years, Sarah felt the magnitude of the decision weighing on her. This wasn't just first contact. It was an invitation to fundamentally change the trajectory of human civilization. Through the quantum link, she sent a simple message back to the network. "We're interested, but we'll need time to discuss this with the rest of our species." The response came back immediately, carrying harmonics of amusement and understanding. "Time is something we have in abundance. Take all you need. We have waited this long to find a species like yours. We can wait a little longer for your answer." As Sarah began to withdraw from the connection, she felt one final message from the network, not words or concepts, but pure emotion. "Welcome. At last. Welcome to the greater community." The chamber around her came back into focus, and Sarah realized that the Pyrothans had been watching her connection attempts with fascination and growing alarm. Her consciousness had been linked to the network for only minutes from her perspective, but apparently hours had passed in real time. "What did you discover?" the Ancient One asked, its voice carrying undertones of uncertainty that Sarah had never heard before. Sarah looked up at the massive being and smiled. "I think humanity just got invited to join something that's going to change everything we see." The construction of the quantum consciousness detector took 3 days that felt like an eternity to Sarah. She watched in amazement as the Pyrothans worked with technologies that bent the laws of physics around their will. Crystalline matrices grew from pure thought. Metal flowed like water to form impossible geometric shapes, and energy fields were woven together with the precision of master craftsmen. Sarah found herself at the center of the project. Despite being the smallest and least powerful being in the chamber, the Pyrothans constantly consulted with her about the theoretical requirements, and she was surprised to discover that her intuitive understanding of quantum mechanics complemented their mathematical precision in unexpected ways. Crystallis had appointed herself as Sarah's primary collaborator, a development that seemed to amuse the Ancient One greatly. The young Pyrothan's attitude had completely transformed from condescension to genuine respect. She began each conversation with formal acknowledgement of Sarah's insights, a courtesy that left the human girl both honored and slightly overwhelmed. "The challenge has become secondary," Crystallis admitted during one of their working sessions. "Whether you win or lose, this project has value beyond our original competition." Sarah nodded, understanding the significance of that admission. For creatures as proud as the Pyrothans, acknowledging value in the work of a primitive species represented a fundamental shift in perspective. The detector itself was unlike anything in human experience. At its core was a crystalline matrix that existed partially outside normal spacetime, allowing it to perceive quantum fluctuations without being influenced by them. Surrounding this were layers of processing systems that could filter cosmic background radiation, stellar interference, and the massive psychic presence of the Pyrothans themselves. The most challenging aspect was calibrating the sensors to detect something that might not exist at all. Sarah's theory provided the mathematical framework, but translating that into actual measurements required innovations that pushed even Pyrothan technology to its limits. As the final components came online, an expectant hush fell over the chamber. Dozens of Pyrothans had gathered to witness the test, their massive forms creating an amphitheater of burning eyes and crystalline growths. Even the Ancient One had moved closer, its presence making the very air shimmer with barely contained energy. Sarah stood beside the detector's control interface, her human hands looking impossibly small against the alien controls. Crystallis had modified the system to respond to human neural patterns, allowing Sarah to operate the device directly. "Are you prepared?" the Ancient One asked, its voice carrying harmonics that made the chamber walls sing in response. Sarah took a deep breath and placed her hands on the control surface. The interface came alive under her touch, responding to her thoughts and intentions in ways that felt almost magical. Through the connection, she could sense the vast sensitivity of the instrument, capable of detecting quantum fluctuations so subtle that they existed at the very edge of measurable reality. "Initiating scan," she announced, her voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment. The detector began its work, reaching out across space with senses that could perceive the quantum structure of reality itself. Data flowed through the system in patterns too complex for human comprehension, but the Pyrothans could read the results in real time. For the first few minutes, the detector found nothing unusual. Background quantum noise filled the displays, showing the expected random fluctuations of empty space. Several Pyrothans shifted restlessly, and Sarah felt doubt beginning to creep into her mind. Then Crystallis spoke, her voice tight with excitement. "There, grid coordinates 47.3, by 1 to 12.8. The pattern is exactly as you predicted." Sarah's heart leaped as she saw it too, a subtle but unmistakable pattern in the quantum noise, like a fingerprint pressed into the fabric of space-time itself. The signature was centered on a star system known to harbor an advanced civilization, and its characteristics matched her theoretical predictions perfectly. "Expand the scan," Sarah said, her confidence returning. "If I'm right, we should find signatures around every inhabited world in this sector." The detector's range expanded, reaching out to encompass hundreds of star systems. One by one, consciousness signatures began appearing on the displays. Each was unique, reflecting the particular characteristics of the civilizations that generated them. Some pulsed with the rhythmic patterns of biological thought, while others showed the crystalline precision of artificial intelligence. The Pyrothans watched in stunned silence as their understanding of the galaxy was fundamentally rewritten. Civilizations they had never detected were suddenly visible, their consciousness fields creating a vast web of interconnected thought that spanned the stars. But the most shocking discovery was yet to come. As the detector reached its maximum range, it began detecting signatures that defied all their expectations. There were consciousness fields in apparently empty space, others that seemed to exist outside normal time, and some that displayed characteristics unlike anything in their xenobiological databases. "There are far more conscious species in the galaxy than we ever imagined," the Ancient One said, its voice filled with something that might have been wonder, "and many of them exist in forms we cannot even comprehend." Sarah felt a surge of vindication but also humility. Her theory had been proven correct, but the implications were far beyond what she had anticipated. The galaxy was alive with consciousness in ways that challenged the assumptions of every known species. Crystallis was analyzing the data streams with increasing excitement. "The patterns suggest communication," she announced. "These consciousness fields are not isolated. They are interacting with each other across interstellar distances." The revelation sent ripples of shock through the assembled Pyrothans. They were witnessing evidence of a galactic consciousness network that operated on principles completely different from their own psychic abilities. While Pyrathan telepathy was based on direct mental contact, this network used quantum entanglement to create connections that transcended space and time. Sarah stared at the displays in awe. Her simple hypothesis about consciousness as a fundamental force had uncovered evidence of something far more profound, a hidden layer of galactic civilization that had existed undetected for who knew how long. We have been blind, the Ancient One said quietly. In our arrogance, we believed ourselves to be the ultimate arbiters of galactic consciousness. But we have been mere observers, watching only the surface of something far more complex. The admission represented a complete revolution in Pyrathan thinking. For millions of years, they had seen themselves as the galaxy's supreme beings, responsible for guiding the development of lesser species. Now they were discovering that they had been missing the majority of galactic civilization entirely. Sarah removed her hands from the control interface, feeling suddenly drained. The magnitude of what they had discovered was overwhelming, and she knew that the implications would take years to fully understand. The challenge is concluded, the Ancient One declared, though its voice carried none of the ceremony that should have accompanied such an announcement. The human has not only won, she has fundamentally altered our understanding of reality itself. But Sarah barely heard the declaration. She was staring at a particular signature on the display, a familiar pattern that made her heart race with excitement. There, at the very edge of the detector's range, was a consciousness signature unlike any of the others, young, chaotic, bursting with curiosity and determination. It was centered on a small star system in an unremarkable spiral arm of the galaxy, a system containing a blue-green world that its inhabitants called Earth. Humanity had just announced its presence to the hidden consciousness network of the galaxy, and something was already responding. Sarah's fingers moved across the holographic interface with growing confidence as her theory took shape. The Pyrathan database was overwhelming in its complexity, but she had found her angle of attack. While Crystallis continued her systematic analysis of known physical laws, Sarah was building something entirely different. The key insight had come from studying Pyrathan neural structure. Their consciousness operated across multiple dimensional layers, allowing them to perceive reality in ways that seemed magical to lesser species. But this variability created a fundamental blind spot. They couldn't conceive of intelligence that operated purely within a single-dimensional framework. Humans, by contrast, were locked into three-dimensional thinking by their biology. This limitation, which the Pyrothans saw as primitive, actually allowed humans to perceive patterns that multidimensional beings missed entirely. It was like the difference between looking at a forest from above versus walking through it on the ground level. Sarah's hypothesis was taking shape around a concept she was calling consciousness resonance. She theorized that all conscious beings created subtle distortions in the fabric of space-time, similar to how massive objects created gravitational fields. But unlike gravity, these consciousness fields operated on quantum scales and could be detected only by beings operating within the same dimensional framework. The implications were staggering. If she was right, it meant that every civilization in the galaxy was broadcasting its presence through quantum signatures that most species couldn't detect. The Pyrathans, with their multi-dimensional awareness, had been unconsciously filtering out these signals for millions of years. Crystallis had noticed the shift in attention from the gathered Pyrathans. Her own work on theoretical particle mechanics was proceeding well, but the Ancient One and the others were watching the human with increasing fascination. She began to analyze Sarah's data streams, trying to understand what the primitive creature could possibly be working on. What she saw made no sense. The human was correlating biological data with quantum mechanics, linking consciousness studies with stellar formation patterns, and somehow making mathematical connections that Crystallis had never considered. The work was crude by Pyrathan standards, but there was an underlying logic that was entirely alien to their way of thinking. "What are you proposing?" Crystallis demanded, her voice carrying harmonics of frustration and curiosity. Sarah looked up from her work, meeting the massive creature's burning gaze. "I'm proposing that consciousness is a fundamental force of the universe, just like gravity or electromagnetism, and I think I can prove it using your own data." The chamber fell silent except for the humming of energy fields. The idea that consciousness could be a fundamental force was not new. Several species had explored similar concepts, but they had all approached it from the perspective of advanced beings trying to understand their own abilities. Sarah was approaching it from the opposite direction. "Elaborate," the Ancient One commanded, its voice carrying new undertones of genuine interest. Sarah gestured to her holographic display, where complex diagrams showed the quantum signatures she had identified. "Every conscious being creates tiny distortions in space-time," she explained. "These distortions are too small for your instruments to detect because you're looking at the wrong scale. You're used to thinking in terms of stellar mechanics and cosmic forces, but consciousness operates at the intersection between quantum mechanics and biology." She manipulated the display to show a three-dimensional map of the local galactic region. "If I'm right, then every inhabited world should be generating a detectable quantum signature. The patterns should be visible if you know how to look for them." Crystalis moved closer, her massive head hovering over Sarah's workspace. "The mathematics are primitive, but—" She paused, running calculations through her vast intellect. "There is internal consistency to your hypothesis," Sarah nodded. "The reason no one has detected these signatures before is because advanced species like yours develop consciousness that operates across multiple dimensions. You literally think your way out of the quantum framework where these effects occur. It's like becoming so tall that you can't see what's happening at ground level anymore." The Ancient One's eyes blazed brighter as it considered the implications. If the human was correct, it would mean that the Pyrothans had been unconsciously blind to an entire layer of galactic activity. Civilizations could be rising and falling without their knowledge, hidden behind the very limitations of biological intelligence that the Pyrothans had transcended eons ago. "How would you test this hypothesis?" the Ancient One asked. Sarah smiled. "We look for the signatures. If consciousness really is a fundamental force, then we should be able to detect quantum distortions around every inhabited world in the galaxy. The patterns should be different for different types of consciousness, biological, artificial, energy-based, whatever." She manipulated her display to show a theoretical detection array. "The problem is that the effect is incredibly subtle. You need sensors that can detect quantum fluctuations while filtering out all the background noise from stellar activity, cosmic radiation, and the kind of high-energy processes that Pyrothans use for everything." Crystalis was now fully engaged, her earlier condescension replaced by scientific curiosity. "The required sensitivity would be enormous. We would need to build entirely new types of instruments." "Exactly," Sarah said. "And that's why this discovery was waiting for someone like me. You're so used to working with cosmic-scale phenomena that you never thought to look for something this delicate. Humans are still learning to detect quantum effects at all, so we're naturally thinking at the right scale." The Ancient One began to move, its massive form creating vibrations that resonated through the crystalline structure. "We will construct the necessary instruments," it declared. "If your hypothesis can be verified, then you'll have discovered an entirely new way of understanding the universe," Sarah finished. "And maybe more importantly, you'll have proven that there are still things worth learning, even for beings as advanced as you." The chamber erupted in activity as dozens of Pyrothans began collaborating on the design of detection equipment sensitive enough to test Sarah's theory. Their excitement was palpable. For the first time in millennia, they were working on something genuinely new, rather than just cataloging variations of known phenomena. Crystalis remained beside Sarah's workspace, her massive intellect now focused on refining the human's crude mathematics. "Your calculations contain several errors," she said, but her tone had changed completely. "But the underlying concept? It is brilliant in its simplicity." Sarah felt a surge of pride, but also something deeper. She was watching beings who had grown stagnant in their omnipotence rediscover the joy of scientific inquiry. The Pyrothans were remembering what it felt like to be surprised, to encounter something that challenged their understanding of reality. But the real test was still to come. Building the instruments would take time, even with Pyrothan technology. And there was no guarantee that Sarah's theory was correct. If the test failed to detect the consciousness signatures she predicted, her challenge would be lost. The Ancient One approached her workspace, its presence making the air itself seem to thicken. "Regardless of the outcome," it said quietly, "you have already accomplished something remarkable. You have reminded us what it means to be curious. Sarah looked up at the massive creature that could have destroyed her with a thought. That's all humans have ever wanted, she said. The chance to keep learning, to keep pushing boundaries. We may not live as long as you or grow as powerful, but we never stop asking what if. The Ancient One's expression was unreadable, but something had changed in its bearing. Perhaps, it said slowly, that is a strength we had forgotten we once possessed. As the Perothans worked frantically to build instruments that could test a theory proposed by a creature they had dismissed as primitive, Sarah allowed herself a moment of quiet satisfaction. Win or lose, she had already changed something fundamental about how these ancient beings saw themselves and their place in the universe. Now came the hardest part, waiting to see if she was right. The Ancient One's massive head tilted as it contemplated Sarah's words. Around the chamber, younger Pyrothans exchanged glances with eyes that burned like miniature suns. The silence stretched for what felt like hours, broken only by the occasional rumble from the crystalline walls as they adjusted to the emotional temperature of their occupants. Sarah used the quiet to study her surroundings more carefully. The technology here was beyond anything she had imagined, but it followed patterns she could begin to understand. The Pyrothans had evolved past the need for crude mechanical devices. Instead, they manipulated matter and energy through what appeared to be conscious will, backed by an understanding of physics that made human science look like finger painting. Yet there was something sterile about it all. For all their power, the Pyrothans had created a static civilization. Their great hall was magnificent but unchanging, their technology perfect but stagnant. Sarah began to understand why the Ancient One was listening to her instead of simply incinerating her on the spot. Small human, the Ancient One finally spoke, its voice carrying new undertones that made the other Pyrothans shift uneasily. Your words carry unexpected wisdom. Perhaps it is true that we have grown complacent. A younger Pyrothan, its scales still bearing the bright gold of relative youth, spoke up. Ancient One, surely you do not give credence to the babbling of this primitive creature. Humans have existed for mere moments. What could they possibly teach us? Sarah saw her opportunity and took it. We could teach you what it feels like to be genuinely surprised again, she said. When humans first looked through telescopes, we discovered that our planet wasn't the center of the universe. When we split atoms, we found energy we never knew existed. Every generation of humans has had to completely reimagine what they thought they knew about reality. She gestured toward the massive beings surrounding her. You've known you were the most powerful creatures in the galaxy for so long that you've stopped questioning what that means. You've become administrators instead of explorers. The golden-scaled Pyrothon reared back, plasma beginning to build in its throat. Insolent whelp, we have explored every corner of this galaxy. Have you? Sarah asked calmly. Or have you just conquered every corner? There's a difference between mapping territory and understanding it. Humans have been on Earth for hundreds of thousands of years, and we're still discovering new things about our own planet every day. The Ancient One raised one massive claw, and the younger Pyrothon immediately fell silent. When the Ancient One spoke again, there was something new in its voice, not quite uncertainty, but the beginning of curiosity. What do you propose, little human? Sarah took a deep breath. This was the moment everything depended on. A challenge, she said. Pick your most knowledgeable Pyrothon, someone who thinks they understand everything about how the universe works. Give me access to the same information they have, and let's see who can find something new first. The chamber erupted in roars of disbelief and outrage. Several Pyrothons began rising to their feet, their massive forms crackling with barely contained energy. The very walls of the chamber began to glow red-hot from the collective emotional response, but the Ancient One was smiling, if the terrifying expression that crossed its features could be called a smile. Interesting, and what would be the stakes of this challenge? Sarah's heart was racing, but her voice remained steady. If I lose, you can do whatever you want with me. But if I win, you release me and consider that maybe there are still things in this universe worth learning about. And if we refuse, then you prove my point, Sarah said. You've become so comfortable with your power that you're afraid to risk it, even against a primitive mammal who should pose no threat to you whatsoever. The psychological blow landed perfectly. The Pyrothons were creatures of immense pride, and Sarah had just suggested that they were acting like cowards. The Ancient One's eyes blazed brighter as it considered the implications. Very well, it said finally. But we will modify the terms. You will compete against Crystallis, our youngest adult. The Ancient One gestured toward a pyrothon that was merely the size of a large building. She has studied the fundamental forces of the universe for only 3,000 of your years. Sarah felt her confidence waver for a moment. 3,000 years of study by a creature with mental capabilities that dwarfed her own. But then she remembered something her astronomy professor had once told her. Sometimes the most important discoveries came not from knowing more, but from looking at familiar things from a completely different angle. Crystallis herself seemed amused by the whole situation. "This is beneath my dignity," she said, her voice carrying the musical harmonics of crystalline formations. "But I confess to being curious about how quickly I can humiliate this creature." The Ancient One gestured, and the chamber began to reconfigure itself. Walls flowed like liquid, creating two distinct workspace areas. In each space, holographic displays materialized, showing vast databases of information about galactic physics, stellar mechanics, and fundamental forces. "The challenge is this," the Ancient One announced. "Each contestant will have access to our complete scientific database. The goal is to formulate a new hypothesis about the nature of reality that can be tested and verified. The first to present a valid theory wins." Sarah approached her workspace and felt overwhelmed by the sheer scope of information available. The pyrothons had accumulated knowledge spanning millions of years and thousands of civilizations. Their understanding of physics made human science look like primitive cave paintings. But as she began to explore the database, Sarah noticed something interesting. The pyrothons' approach to knowledge was incredibly thorough, but also rigid. They cataloged and categorized everything, building vast theoretical frameworks that explained known phenomena with mathematical precision. What they didn't do was question their fundamental assumptions. Crystallis had already begun working, her massive intellect processing information at speeds that made Sarah's head spin, just watching the data streams. The young pyrothon was approaching the challenge exactly as Sarah had expected, by looking for gaps in their existing knowledge that could be filled with new theories. Sarah took a different approach. Instead of looking for what the pyrothons didn't know, she started examining what they thought they did know. She focused on their most basic assumptions about the nature of space, time, and consciousness. Hours passed. Crystallis was deep in calculations that involved mathematics so advanced that the symbols themselves seemed to bend space around them. Several times she paused to roar in frustration as promising theoretical paths led to dead ends. Sarah, meanwhile, was reading about pyrothon history and biology. She learned that their species had evolved from creatures that lived in the hearts of stars, feeding on nuclear reactions and using stellar magnetic fields as nervous systems. Their consciousness was distributed across multiple dimensions, allowing them to perceive and manipulate reality in ways that purely physical beings could never achieve. But that evolutionary history also created blind spots. The pyrothons understood the universe from the perspective of beings who had always been part of its most energetic processes. They thought in terms of stellar mechanics and cosmic forces, because that was the scale at which their consciousness operated. Sarah began to smile as an idea formed in her mind. It was crazy, probably wrong, and definitely impossible to prove with human technology. But if she was right, it would change everything the pyrothons thought they knew about the nature of existence itself. She began to work, building her hypothesis step by step. Around her, the assembled pyrothons watched with growing interest, as the small humans started making connections that none of them had ever considered. Crystallis noticed the change in atmosphere and looked up from her calculations. For the first time since the challenge began, doubt crept into her burning eyes. The primitive creature wasn't just randomly accessing their database anymore. She was working with purpose, building towards something that even Crystallis couldn't predict. The real challenge was just beginning. The Vorthak ship shuddered as it passed through the outer defenses of the pyrothon's domain. Sarah felt the artificial gravity fluctuate, making her stomach lurch as the vessel was scanned by technologies that registered as pure malevolence on her nervous system. The hull itself seemed to recoil from the probing energies, and she could hear her captors whimpering in their alien language. Through the viewport, Sarah got her first glimpse of the creatures that ruled this corner of the galaxy. They moved through space without ships, their massive forms cutting through the cosmic winds like living battleships. Each pyrothon was easily the size of a city block, with scales that glowed like molten metal and wings that could have wrapped around Earth's moon. Their heads were magnificent and terrible, bearing crowns of horn and crystal that pulsed with inner fire. Eyes like dying stars tracked the approaching Vorthak vessel with predatory intelligence. When they breathed, streams of plasma erupted from their nostrils, creating new constellations that burned against the backdrop of the nebula. The largest of them approached the ship directly. Sarah could feel its presence pressing against her mind like a physical weight. This creature was ancient beyond human comprehension, having witnessed the birth and death of countless civilizations. When it spoke, reality itself seemed to bend around its words. Vorthak insects. The voice boomed inside everyone's head simultaneously. You dare return to our domain. Speak quickly before we reduce your atoms to component particles. The Vorthak captain prostrated itself before the communication device, its 4 eyes dim with terror. Through rapid gestures and the mental projection system, it began explaining their purpose. Images flowed from the device, rare crystals from the Andromeda galaxy, metals that could only be forged in the hearts of supernovas, and finally, Sarah herself. The great Parathan's attention shifted to the human girl, and Sarah felt her mind being invaded by an intelligence so vast and alien that it made her ears bleed. Memories flashed through her consciousness, her childhood, her dreams of space exploration, her father's stories about human persistence. But beneath the surface thoughts, the Parathan found something unexpected. Sarah wasn't just observing the creature. She was analyzing it. Her mind, trained by years of studying astronomy and physics, was cataloging everything she could perceive about Parathan biology and behavior. Even while being mentally dissected by a cosmic predator, she was learning. The Parathan recoiled slightly, surprised by the complexity it found in such a small creature. Most species that encountered them for the first time either went insane or died from the psychic contact. This human was not only surviving but studying them in return. Interesting, the creature rumbled. This small thing possesses unusual mental resilience. We accept the Vorthak tribute. The ship was guided by invisible forces to a massive structure that seemed to grow from the surface of a crystalline asteroid. The docking bay was a cavern of living rock that reshaped itself to accommodate visiting vessels. As they landed, Sarah felt the temperature rise dramatically. The very air here was charged with energies that made her skin tingle. 2 smaller Pyrothans awaited them at the airlock. Smaller was relative. Each was still the size of a passenger jet, with scales that shifted between deep red and gold. Their intelligence was immediately apparent in the way they moved, every gesture controlled and purposeful. The Vorthak captain led Sarah from the ship on a gravity leash, a beam of energy that made her steps heavy but didn't quite immobilize her. The moment she stepped onto Pyrathan territory, Sarah felt the full weight of an environment designed for creatures that could manipulate matter with their thoughts. The corridors they walked through were impossible geometries that shifted and flowed like liquid architecture. Walls displayed scenes from across the galaxy, battles between star fleets, the birth of new worlds, the death of old ones. Sarah realized she was looking at live footage. The Pyrothans were monitoring the entire galaxy in real time. They entered a vast chamber where dozens of Pyrothans had gathered. Each was unique, bearing different patterns of scales and crystal formations that seemed to indicate age and status. The smallest was still larger than a blue whale, while the largest filled spaces that could have housed entire cities. At the center of the gathering sat the Ancient One. This Pyrathan was so old that stars had been born and died during its lifetime. Its scales had taken on the deep purple of nebula gas, and its eyes held the wisdom and cruelty of eons. When it looked at Sarah, she felt like an insect being examined by a scientist. "So this is the human," the Ancient One spoke, its voice carrying harmonics that made the crystal walls sing. "We have heard whispers of your species, young mammals, who think they can conquer the cosmos with primitive technology." The other Pyrothans rumbled with what might have been laughter. Sarah felt their amusement like acid in her mind. To them, humanity was just another upstart species that would burn itself out in a few thousand years. Barely a blink of an eye by Pyrothan standards, but Sarah had spent the entire journey preparing for this moment. She understood now that the Pyrothans saw themselves as the ultimate arbiters of galactic civilization. They allowed certain species to thrive while destroying others based on criteria that remained mysterious to most of the galaxy. "We didn't think we could conquer anything," Sarah said clearly, her voice carrying in the alien acoustics of the chamber. "We just wanted to see what was out there." The Ancient One leaned forward, interested despite itself. Most creatures brought before them begged for mercy or tried to negotiate. This small human was having a conversation. "And what have you seen, little mammal?" Sarah looked around the chamber, taking in the assembled might of creatures that could destroy solar systems. She thought about her father's stories, about human explorers who had faced the unknown with nothing but curiosity and determination. Then she smiled. "I've seen beings so powerful they've forgotten what it means to discover something new," she said. "You've been watching the galaxy for so long that you've stopped participating in it. When was the last time any of you learned something that actually surprised you?" The chamber fell silent. Several pyrothans shifted uncomfortably, their massive forms creating small earthquakes in the crystalline floor. The Ancient One's eyes narrowed to points of nuclear fire. "You dare lecture us, infant species?" Sarah's heart was pounding, but she forced herself to stand straighter. "I'm not lecturing anyone. I'm just wondering why creatures with your capabilities choose to sit in one place instead of exploring what's beyond your borders. Humans have been spacefaring for less than a century, and we've already found things that challenge everything we thought we knew about physics." She paused, letting that sink in before delivering her real point. "Maybe the reason you're all so bored is because you've stopped taking risks." The reaction was immediate and violent. Several younger Pyrothans roared in outrage, plasma streaming from their nostrils. The temperature in the chamber spiked to levels that should have killed any organic life form instantly. But Sarah remained standing, protected by some field the Ancient One had unconsciously generated. Because despite the fury of its subordinates, the Ancient One was thinking. This small creature had identified something that had been gnawing at the edges of its consciousness for millennia. The Pyrothans had become so focused on maintaining their dominance that they had indeed stopped growing, stopped learning, stopped becoming more than they were. "Silence," the Ancient One commanded, and the chamber immediately quieted. It studied Sarah with new interest, seeing her not as a potential pet or snack but as something far more dangerous, a catalyst for change. Sarah Martinez had always dreamed of seeing the stars, but not like this. The 16-year-old girl pressed herself against the cold metal wall of what she could only describe as a flying prison cell. Through the transparent barrier, she watched Earth shrink to a tiny blue dot before disappearing entirely into the void of space. Her captors were unlike anything from human imagination. The Vorthak stood nearly 8 feet tall with elongated limbs that bent in impossible directions. Their skin resembled polished obsidian, and their faces featured 4 eyes arranged in a diamond pattern. When they spoke, it sounded like grinding metal mixed with electronic static. The ship itself defied human understanding of physics. Corridors twisted and curved in ways that hurt to look at, and gravity seemed to flow in different directions depending on where you stood. Sarah had given up trying to understand the architecture and focused on staying alive. She remembered the moment everything changed. 1 second, she was walking home from her part-time job at the local observatory, and the next, a blinding light had engulfed her. When her vision cleared, she found herself in this nightmare. The Vorthak had communicated through some kind of mental projection, showing her images of what they intended. She was to be a gift. A rare specimen from a newly discovered world, presented to the most feared creature in their galaxy. The thought made her stomach churn, but Sarah refused to show weakness. Her father had always told her that humans were tougher than they looked, and she was determined to prove him right. The ship's walls hummed with an alien energy that made her teeth ache. Through conversations she had overheard between her captors, Sarah learned they were traveling to a place called the Crimson Nebula. There, in the heart of a dying star system, lived something so dangerous that even the warlike Vorthak spoke of it in hushed, reverent tones. Days passed in the cramped cell. The Vorthak fed her a substance that tasted like metal shavings but somehow provided all the nutrition her body needed. She exercised in the limited space, keeping her muscles strong and her mind sharp. Sarah knew that panic would be her enemy, so she forced herself to observe everything, to learn, to prepare for whatever was coming. The youngest of her captors, who seemed barely more than a child by Vorthak standards, sometimes lingered near her cell. Sarah had begun to recognize the patterns in their language and realized this one was curious about her. She started speaking to it, sharing stories about Earth, about humanity's history of overcoming impossible odds. The young Vorthak would tilt its head in that peculiar way when she talked about human explorers who had crossed vast oceans in wooden ships, or scientists who had split atoms with primitive tools. Sarah could see something like wonder in its 4 eyes, though she wasn't sure if that was possible for their species. As the journey continued, Sarah learned more about her destination. The Crimson Nebula was home to creatures the Vorthak called the Parothans. These beings were apparently so ancient and powerful that they had become legends throughout the galaxy. They resembled what humans might call dragons, but that comparison barely scratched the surface of their true nature. The Pyrothans could manipulate matter at the molecular level, breathe plasma that could melt through starship hulls, and possessed psychic abilities that allowed them to read thoughts across star systems. They were also intensely territorial and had destroyed entire civilizations that dared to enter their domain uninvited. The Vorthak had spent decades preparing for this journey. They had gathered rare metals and energy crystals as tribute, hoping to gain an audience with the Pyrothans without being instantly vaporized. Sarah was meant to be the crown jewel of their offering, a representative of a species so new to the galactic community that most beings had never encountered a human. The irony wasn't lost on her. Humanity had just taken its first tentative steps into space, building small colonies on Mars and the Moon. They had no idea that vast civilizations existed beyond their solar system, and now one of their own was about to be presented to creatures that could snuff out worlds on a whim. Sarah spent her time planning. She had no weapons, no way to escape the ship, and no knowledge of how to operate alien technology. But she had something her captors didn't expect: the accumulated wisdom of a species that had clawed its way to the top of Earth's food chain through sheer determination and ingenuity. As the ship approached the Crimson Nebula, the temperature began to rise. The hull groaned under stresses that made the Vorthak nervous, and Sarah could see sweat-like secretions on their obsidian skin. Whatever waited for them in that red-tinged region of space, even her captors were afraid of it. Through the viewport, Sarah watched as stars took on an angry red hue. The nebula stretched before them like a vast wound in space itself, pulsing with energies that made the ship's instruments scream warnings in their alien language. In the distance, she could see structures that defied description: cities built inside asteroids, space stations that looked like they had been grown rather than constructed, and ships that moved like living creatures through the cosmic dust. The Vorthak captain approached her cell, its 4 eyes fixed on her with something that might have been regret. Through the mental projection device, it showed her images of what was to come. She would be presented to the Pyrothans as a curiosity, a pet perhaps, or maybe just an interesting snack. Sarah stood up straight and looked the captain in all 4 of its eyes. "You have no idea what you're doing," she said quietly. "Humans don't make good pets." The captain tilted its head, perhaps wondering if this small creature was actually threatening it. Sarah smiled, and for just a moment the captain took a step back. There was something in that smile that didn't belong on the face of a helpless prisoner. As their ship descended into the heart of the Crimson Nebula, Sarah Martinez prepared to show the galaxy exactly what humanity was capable of.